How's it going, everybody? My name is StevieWunderKid, and today I'm going to be going over what I believe to be the best cars for drifting in GTA 5 Online in 2020 without the use of mods. So this video is going to showcase 25 plus cars that I've tested over the past few months that I believe are more than capable of drifting properly at various speeds. So we're going to start off this video by briefly running through an unranked list of 20 cars that I believe are pretty solid honorable or noteworthy mentions. So these cars aren't the best of the best for drifting, but are still some great options for drift cars you should definitely consider in addition to the top 5 cars, which I have ranked and will be featured at the end of the video. In addition to those cars, I also have included a list of some other cars I've tested that are capable of drifting in case you guys are interested. So this video has taken me a pretty long time to make in between testing and recording the best clips to show these cars in action. So if the video ends up helping you out in any way, please remember to show some support by liking the video, leaving a comment, and or subscribing to my channel for more videos like this. So before the video begins, I wanted to mention two things very briefly. The first thing is that the clips that I'm using to showcase these best drift cars in GTA 5 were all recorded entirely without the use of mods on my Xbox One console using a standard Xbox One controller. So the style of drifting that's showcased in the video relies on the use of the mid-drive speed boost, also called the double clutch, the e-brake boost, or the clutch kick, essentially to keep the car sideways at higher speeds through those longer corners. So in theory, the mid-drive speed boost is pretty simple to do. The idea behind it is very easy. All you really need to do is, as you approach the top of second gear, you're going to very quickly let go of the gas, tap the handbrake, and then get right back on the throttle. Now what this essentially does is it over revs the car in second gear, giving the car a pretty massive speed boost and also breaking those tires loose. But while the basic idea behind the mid-drive speed boost again is pretty simple, because all you're really doing is tapping the handbrake, the key when you're drifting is timing it perfectly so that way you can properly engage it and carry the car through those longer corners. Now this requires quite a bit of practice to know where in the rev range you're going to want to tap the handbrake to engage it, and also how many times you're going to need to re-engage it to carry the car all the way through a longer drift. In addition to that, it does require a little bit of muscle memory to know exactly how quick you're supposed to tap that handbrake and re-engage the throttle. So all around pretty technical when you're using it for drifting, which is why I'd recommend you guys practice this movement just moving in a straight line first, and then you take this and try to work it in as you're drifting. So the second thing that I wanted to mention is that in order to drift in the way that's shown in the video, making full use of the mid-drive speed boost as I just discussed, it's recommended that you guys use the trick to manually lower or stance or slam your vehicle using a weapon. So if you guys aren't familiar with this method, essentially this is a way to forcefully damage the suspension of your vehicle to make it less grippy and thus easier to drift, and this is separate from any suspension upgrades that you've already applied at a mod shop. So essentially, to be able to stance your vehicle in the first place, you cannot have bulletproof tires. If you try to stance a vehicle that has bulletproof tires, it'll just blow up in your face. It sucks, I know, and unfortunately if you have bulletproof tires already on your vehicle, you can't take them off. So probably the most crucial step in this process is making sure you start with a car that doesn't have bulletproof tires. So some weapons I'd recommend you guys use when you're stancing your vehicle are any pistol, AR, SMG, or sniper rifle. Any other higher powered weapons like shotguns, machine guns, miniguns, or others will cause a little bit too much damage and might risk popping your tires or damaging other parts of your vehicle. So there's two ways you can stance your vehicle. There's the easy way and the hard way. Now the easy way is pretty simple, hence the name, and this essentially involves shooting the lower half of the wheel halfway in between where the lug nuts are and the outer edge of the rim, essentially where the brake caliper would be if you're able to see it through the rims that you're using. This is a pretty simple process. As long as you shoot in that general area in the lower half of the wheel, you should be okay and the car will lower no problem. Now on the other hand, the hard way involves shooting the small gap in between the back of the tire and the fender or the quarter panel, or if there isn't any gap that exists there, you're gonna have to shoot the back bottom portion of the fenders and the quarter panels. So as long as you guys, again, make sure that you don't have bulletproof tires on your car and you use the methods that I've just explained properly, you should notice after enough shots of whatever weapon you're using, the car will drop to the ground 2 separate times. So as is the goal of using this method, the stance vehicle should be noticeably less grippy and more responsive to bumps in the road. Also, it will visibly be much lower than it was before. So most cars can be stanced using the easy way, however not all cars can be lowered this way. So if you're ever unsure of which method will work, I'd recommend you guys start up a GTA race and experiment with the two different methods to see what the best method is without blowing the car up or damaging it unnecessarily. So I thought it was important for me to mention those two things before I kick the video off. So without further ado, let's get into the cars. So we're going to kick this unranked list off with arguably the most well-known drift car in the game, the Karen Fudo. Now the best way that I can describe the Karen Fudo is cheap fun. This thing is a great cheap beginner car for drifting at lower speeds because you really don't need to use the mid-drive speed boost to get it sideways because it has so much low-end power. On the other hand, it is a little bit harder to drift at higher speeds because it has just a little bit too much grip and not enough power. However, it still is a great all-rounder and you really can't beat its value. So the next car that we have is the Volker Nebula Turbo, which is another pretty well-known drift car. Now at lower speeds, the Nebula Turbo is a lot like the Fudo. This car is very slidey and easy to drift, especially for beginners, because it has so much low end power. So all you really need to do to drift it at those speeds is really just to tap the handbrake. However, at higher speeds, this thing is way harder to drift, even more difficult than the Fudo. For whatever reason, the drivetrain just feels way different and the car has so much grip. And in addition to that, the car just doesn't have enough power. It is overall pretty expensive and it does have a fairly low ceiling for drifting purposes. However, the car's styling and the modifications you could do to it, as well as its low speed driftability, make it a pretty solid beginner drift car if you have the money. Next up we have the D-Class Drift Yosemite. This is another pretty well-known car, and this is very similar to the Nebula Turbo and the Fudo because it's super easy to drift at low speeds. I like the Drift Yosemite a little bit more though because it's way more balanced and it is powerful enough to properly drift at high speeds using the mid-drive speed boost. It is a little bit grippy and you can see some of the original D-Class Yosemite's handling in this car. However, overall this car is a pretty solid drifter with some awesome Puna truck inspired mods. The next car that we have is the Karen 190Z. Now this is a more niche drift car and it isn't used very often because it requires a lot more skill to be able to drift. As with most other cars on this list, this is pretty easy to drift at lower speeds. However, it does handle high speed drifts pretty well because its mid-drive speed boost is pretty strong. However, the car itself doesn't have a whole lot of power, so you do need to be a bit more skilled to be able to repeat the mid-drive speed boost to carry this through those longer speed corners. Overall, this is a pretty lightweight and a more technical car, so it's better suited for more experienced drifters and those who are willing to spend the money on it. Next up is a super underrated drift car, the Dubauchi JB700. Now I wholeheartedly believe more people should give this thing a try. This is one of my personal favorite cars in the game, and there's good reason for that. This car makes a lot of power, so drifting at low speeds is super easy, and drifting at high speeds is also possible if you have a little bit more experience. In my opinion, this is similar to the 190Z when you're drifting at higher speeds. However, I think the JB700 has a little bit more power, so I'd recommend that you guys have some experience if you want to try this car out, but even then, it's still a super underrated car, and I'd definitely give it a shot if you have the chance. Next up we have the Impante Dukes, which is one of my other personal favorite cars for drifting in GTA 5. Now the Dukes has a whole lot of power, so again, low speed drifts can be accomplished no issue. High speed drifts can also be done pretty easily in this car because it has a super strong mid-drive speed boost and it can also hold quite a bit of steering angle. You do need to be a little bit more aggressive when you're driving this car though because it has quite a bit of body roll, but even then this is still a really great budget drifter that you can learn a lot with. So the next car that we have is arguably one of the most unique and underrated drift cars in the game, and that is the Hijack Chameleon. So overall, this car drifts unlike any other car on this list because it is electric, so all you really need to do to drift this car is to tap the handbrake. So because of that, this car can handle pretty much every type of drift, from lower speed, smaller corner drifts, all the way up to drifts through higher speed and longer corners, but it is pretty twitchy, so it requires a little bit more experience with counter steering to keep this car stable without spinning out. So I've actually made a video dedicated to exploring this car's driftability in specific, and that will be linked in the description if you guys want to find out more about this car. Alright, so next up we have the D-Class Sabre Turbo Custom. Now, this car is another muscle car and it reminds me a lot of the Dukes. It just has a little bit more grip but about the same amount of power. So drifting this thing is pretty easy to do, especially at lower speeds. At higher speeds, it requires you to be a bit more aggressive with your entries and also with counter steering to make sure that you can overcome the amount of grip that the car has. But overall, still a pretty powerful and easy to drift car. Next up we have the Bravado Gauntlet. Now this is a pretty commonly overlooked drift car, and just driving it, it feels like a muscle car on ice. It's very powerful and it's got plenty of torque, which means that it's really slidey and easy to drift at lower speeds. At higher speeds it is possible to drift because the car is so heavy, so you can better use its momentum to keep those longer slides going. And the mid-drive speed boost is fairly strong too. It feels a little bit twitchy like the JB700, and also because of the weight and because of the amount of power the car puts down, it's a little bit harder to control and keep sideways without spinning out, but it still is a pretty great, underrated, and budget drift car. Alright, so next up we have the Bravado Gauntlet Hellfire. This car is overall very powerful, which means that lower speed drifts are very easy to do. In addition to that, it has a very strong mid-drive speed boost. At higher speeds, it has a little bit more grip because of the amount of body roll the car has, and it really sucks that you can't actually stance this car. I feel like if it were able to be stanced, it would be much better drift-wise, but overall though, it is a pretty great all-rounder because you can use it for much more than just drifting, and driftability-wise, it is pretty good, and you get a lot for the money you put in. Next up, we have the Vapid Imperator, which is another pretty underrated drift car. Now, the Imperator is super slidey at lower speeds, almost like the Nebula Turbo or the Drift Yosemite, but it can also handle higher speeds a lot better because it's got way more power and way more of a usable mid-drive speed boost. The mid-drive speed boost in this thing is incredibly strong and gives you a huge kick in speed, which you can use to your advantage to get the car through those higher speed, longer drifts. It is a little bit more unstable in those longer drifts because it's got a shorter wheelbase, but even then, you can still do quite a bit with this car. It has enough power to pretty much take anywhere with drifting. I would have had this car in the top 5 if it weren't so darn expensive, but overall, it's still a pretty great, underrated, and easy to drift car for those who are willing to spend a lot of money for it. So next up we have the D-Class Pajero, which is another pretty well-known drift car that people have been using for a while. Now this car has plenty of power with a very strong mid-drive speed boost, which means that it's pretty good for all types of drifting, and in the context of muscle cars, I feel like this car is slightly easier to drift because there's less grip you have to account for. This car is much lower to the ground and it doesn't have as much body roll, so you don't need to be as aggressive with your entries or counter steering to get this car sideways, and you can also carry it through those slides longer without the car wanting to straighten out on you. It is a little bit more unstable in the drift because it's got a shorter wheelbase, but overall this car is still a pretty good and cheap overall drifter that I'd recommend you guys check out. Alright, next up we have the Shyster Fusillade, and this car, the best way to describe it is the Bravado Gauntlet as I mentioned earlier, but with like 1,000 times more power. This car really feels like you're driving on ice once you stance it up, so even though it is pretty hard to control when you're in those longer speed drifts, it's got a lot of power, so it's very usable at low or high speeds. As long as you're able to control the car, which is again probably the most difficult aspect of drifting this car, it is pretty good overall. The mid-drive speed boost is very strong, but as I mentioned, the car is pretty unstable and harder to control in the drift, mainly because it's got a shorter wheelbase. Overall though, this is a great budget drifter, but it's better suited to people with more drifting experience. Next up we have one of my personal favorite drift cars, the Pfister Comet Retro Custom. Now I love this car for drifting because it feels very well balanced, and despite the fact that it's such a short car, it actually is pretty stable and fairly easy to control. It's got a lot more grip in comparison with a car like the Fusillade, and it's also more agile in general, so for that reason it can be drifted at low speeds pretty easily and can also be drifted at higher speeds as well with a little bit more control than a car like the Fusillade. The mid-drive speed boost is also very strong. You just need to be able to control it for some of those more technical drifts. It also has some pretty awesome customization because it is a Benny's vehicle, so I'd recommend you guys check this out if you haven't already. So next up we have another super underrated drift car, and a pretty unique one at that, the Vapid Hot Knife. Now like the other muscle cars on this list, the Hot Knife has a lot of power and is capable of drifting at almost any speed, but I want to highlight this car among some of the others that I've talked about because this was another car that was super close to making the top 5 list. Now despite the fact that the car has a short wheelbase and very little steering angle, if you guys drive this car you know that it's very understeery. Now despite those two things, it's actually very easy to control when you're in the drift. Surprisingly enough, the car isn't that twitchy, and because the car is a little bit heavier, you can definitely use the momentum of the car to keep it going through those higher speed slides. So overall, this car is very capable. It also is super cheap and underrated, so I definitely recommend giving this thing a shot. Next up we have the D-Class Mamba. Now this car is very slippery like the Vapid Imperator, and it also is very powerful, which makes those lower speeds, single gear drifts very easy to do. In my opinion, it requires a little bit more skill to drift at higher speeds, and it is pretty twitchy, and when you combine that with the car's strong mid-drive speed boost, it's pretty hard to control without a lot of steering input. You need to be more experienced to drift this car, and it also is pretty expensive, so it isn't for the faint of heart, but still a drift car I thought I'd mention. Next up we have arguably one of the most unique drift cars in the game, the Bravado Yuga. Now the Yuga is very slidey at lower speeds, very similar to cars like the Nebula Turbo and the Drift Yosemite, very sluggish and slow, but also very slidey. Now this car can actually be drifted at higher speeds, but because it is a very heavy van, and because the power band and the gearing is so drastically different, it's pretty hard to drift it through those higher speeds. There's actually a pretty significant delay in engaging the mid-drive speed boost because of the car's limited power band. Overall though, it still is a pretty unique car for its Dajibon inspired styling, and it also is another very unique and super cheap drift car for better use at lower speeds. Alright, next up we have another pretty well-known OG drift car, the Albany Virgo Classic. Now this is a very slow and sluggish car, and also very slippery when it is stanced, which means that it's easy to drift at lower speeds, and despite the fact that it is very slow, you do have enough power to drift at higher speeds as well. It is pretty sluggish, which means that the mid-drive speed boost isn't super consistent, but the car is very heavy, so you can better use that momentum to your advantage for entries and longer drifts. There's also not a whole lot of steering angle to play around with, and when you combine that with this car's weight, it is fairly hard to recover in the event of oversteer, but is still a very slidey car that is pretty good for beginners, so I definitely recommend you guys go and check it out. Alright, so next up we have the Invitero Coquette Classic, which despite the fact that this is a sports classics car, it actually feels very similar to some of the muscle cars that I've talked about, like the Vigero and the Dukes. So there's nothing super special about this car other than the fact that it's super underrated and isn't often used for drifting. It's very powerful with a strong mid-drive speed boost that's also pretty consistent and repeatable, so there's no complaints there. It's also fairly stable and easy to control when you are in the drift, so I definitely recommend you guys try this car out if you want something new. Nothing too special, but still pretty noteworthy, and I thought I'd put it on this list. Alright, so coming in at one of the last noteworthy mentions that we have is the Annis ZR380. Now this is overall a pretty capable drift car that you can use for drifting at almost any speed. However, for whatever reason, the car just feels a little bit more grippy at higher speeds, which makes holding those longer drifts harder to do unless you perform a really aggressive weight transfer to offset some of that grip to keep the car sideways. So in that regard, it is pretty technical, but it is very powerful to begin with, and you can also equip the Arena War Nitrous Boost for that extra kick if you want it. So this was actually another car that was a candidate for the top 5 list, but I decided not to include it there because the car is so expensive. It's also an armored vehicle with disappointing looks and customization in my opinion, and it can only really be used when drifting in free mode, so for those reasons not worthy of being on the top 5 list, but still a pretty noteworthy car that is very capable of drifting. Alright, so to prevent this video from being dragged on for too long, I have another small list here of some other cars that I've had the pleasure of drifting and can verify drift pretty well, and they are pretty comparable to some of the cars that I've just gone over. So if you guys happen to be interested in any more cars, feel free to check out the ones that are on this list. Alright, so kicking off the top 5 list, in the number 5 spot we have the Willard Faction. This car is super easy to slide and also very easy to control as you're in the drift. When you stance the car up, it's very easy to get sideways because it's got a lot of torque, and it's also heavy enough that you can better use the car's momentum for those bigger entries and longer slides. However, because of the car's weight and because it just doesn't have a whole lot of kick, especially at higher speeds, it is very slow and sluggish and it's not a very agile car, so it's better for drifting at those low to medium speeds. Now, this actually ended up beating out the High Knife for the number 5 spot because in my opinion the Faction is slightly easier to control when you're in the drift, and it's also a little bit more forgiving, especially with people who are just trying out drifting for the first time. Another pretty major flaw about this car, which is why it's so low in the top 5 list, is because of its suspension. Now for whatever reason the car's model is super low to the ground, which messes with its collision boundaries, so it's incredibly sensitive to even the smallest bumps in the road, and I have a clip showing just how bad this is. But overall though, this is a pretty well balanced and low cost, cheap beginner drift car. Alright, so coming in at the number 4 spot we have the Benefactor Schwarzer. Now this car feels very similar to the Faction overall with just a little bit more power. It's still a very heavy car, so the momentum helps a lot to keep those longer drifts going, but at the same time it does feel very sluggish, so it has a pretty low ceiling for drifting, but again it does have a sweet spot in those lower to medium speeds. The mid-drive speed boost is very strong, which helps a lot too. This car has a pretty distinct advantage over the Faction because it doesn't have that same suspension bug and it feels a little bit less sluggish, as I mentioned. This is another really great budget option because you can steal this car right off the street and you can have a solid drift car for very little money. In addition to that, this car is probably the best suited for beginners who are just getting started with drifting in GTA. If not the Faction or the Fudo or even another car like the Nebula Turbo, I'd recommend you guys give the Schwarzer a shot. It's slightly more usable and it's very easy to learn with. Alright, so now that we're moving into the top 3, I wanted to talk a little bit more about these cars in specific because I feel like these cars are way more well-rounded and are more capable of drifting at higher speeds. Now with the previous 2 cars that I talked about, they are great for beginners, but at the same time they are pretty slow cars and they have a fairly low ceiling when it comes to drifting. So with that in mind, in the number 3 spot we have the Bravado Redwood Gauntlet. Now this car has a pretty strong mid-drive speed boost, which makes it great for drifting at any speed. The only real problem with this car, which is why it's in the number 3 spot as compared to the number 1 or number 2 spot, is that it is on the lighter side, so it's more agile overall, but it feels slightly more grippy and just a little bit more twitchy at those higher speeds. So while you're not benefiting from that increased weight and therefore a little bit more usable momentum to carry through those longer corners, you still can overcome this with enough skill and practice. It's a great all-rounder that you can get for free if you're a returning player. Even if you're not a returning player, this car is still fairly cheap, so you get a lot of bang for buck and overall one of my personal favorite drift cars. coming in at the number 2 spot, another very well known and popular drift car, the Bravado Banshee 900R. So if you guys have ever watched any sort of GTA 5 drifting videos, you probably have seen this car already, but it's pretty easy to see why this car is one of the best in the game. This car makes an insane amount of power, and with that power you can drift at really high speeds. It's also very easy to drift at lower speeds too because the car is so slidey, so you can actually get away with holding fairly long drifts even in first gear. So if you guys are beginners, doing these single gear drifts, especially in a car like the 900R, is very easy to do. At higher speeds, however, this car requires a lot more skill to be able to control. In my opinion, it's almost too powerful for its own good because the back end kicks out so easily, and because the mid-drive speed boost is so strong, you do need to practice quite a bit to be able to get this car to link longer corners without spinning out. If this car had a little bit more overall stability and just a little bit more angle as well, it would be the number 1 car with no question. But even then, this car is still a really awesome drift car and probably the most usable for drifting in the game. You can take this thing even through super high speed drifts and very long corners with no problem. Again, because it has such a strong mid-drive speed boost, you're able to do that with enough practice. So another unique thing about this car is that there's some room to play around with tuning it in terms of deciding to run a certain type of wheel or even adding a spoiler for some more grip. So it's not really a one size fits all. You can kind of change it up depending on your style of drifting. Now, even though this car is a little bit more expensive, because it is a Benny's vehicle, it does offer some great customization, so you can personalize it pretty much any way you want. Again, it is well suited for more higher skilled drifters, but still, this car cannot be ignored and is more than well deserving of the number 2 spot. So with the 900R in second place, I'm sure you guys already know what's going to be in the number 1 spot, and that is the Dubauchi Rapid GT. Now on its own, the Rapid GT is probably the most well-rounded drift car in the game. It's cheap, it's fairly easy to drift, and is capable of drifting at almost any speed. Now this car has a lot of power with a very strong mid-drive speed boost, and in comparison with the 900R, the Rapid GT just feels more stable, consistent, and overall just easier to control. It's fairly cheap as well, so even though you're not getting a lot of customization, I feel like you do get a lot for the money that you put in. This is definitely not the easiest car to drift with, but it is slightly easier to learn than the 900R. Now, in my opinion, this car feels very similar to the Redwood Gauntlet, but with a little bit more power and slightly less grip. It feels a little bit heavier, but again, that extra momentum makes a world of difference when you're drifting. Now, while the Rapid GT is not as powerful than the 900R, and therefore it doesn't have as high of a ceiling when it comes to drifting, this car still is overall the best in the game. I can't recommend this car enough because, again, it's fairly low cost, it offers exceptional driftability with a high degree of control and consistency, so overall, in my opinion, very well deserving of the number 1 spot. So that concludes my list of what I believe to be the best drift cars in GTA 5 in 2020 without the use of mods. So again, I know this video was a little bit longer, but I wanted to make sure I took my time to showcase each and every car I thought was a capable drift car. So if this video happened to help you out at all, do remember to show some support by liking the video, commenting your opinion, or subscribing to my channel. I hope you guys all enjoyed the video. Thank you all again for watching. I hope you have a great day, stay safe, and I will talk to you in the next one.